Thank you for joining us for our 10-part series on advanced hormone testing. I hope it's been useful. Please do reach out to us if you've got some questions or comments on any of those or things we can further clarify on that. I just wanted to offer some closing thoughts as we close this conversation and just walking through just briefly what we should be doing with each of these tests. A lot of you might be using a particular test for adrenals, but you're really still heavily using serum testing for sex hormones, or maybe you've got a real big insurance-based practice, so you're using a lot of serum testing. Some of you might be big saliva testers, and that's fine with 24-hour urine, and then with our dried urine testing for comprehensive hormones. I wanted to just kind of walk through each of these. With serum testing, it really is a very good way to test sex hormones. Nice to do total and free values if you can. For example, with testosterone, I wouldn't just measure total, but also get the free value. So you've got to be measuring the binding proteins as well. And there's a good amount of information in there. You're missing the metabolites that you can get from urine testing, but still you can make some very reasonable decisions. You really run into trouble when you're trying to do ascertain a lot about the adrenals from serum testing, because there just isn't enough information there really to know what's going on. When you're using oral progesterone, I personally would just stay away from serum testing. The only use really is just from a liability standpoint of saying, look, I'm testing, and there it gets a little difficult, because if you use an immunoassay, and watch the video on oral progesterone if this isn't making any sense, but if you're using an immunoassay, you're going to get a higher value. And that might be for, some liability reason. It might be good to see a progesterone increase. But what's really going on with a mass spec value is that there's not much progesterone going on in terms of an increase. The biggest danger here is using the mentality that you want your value to get into that young, healthy range. And then especially if you use an accurate assay like a mass spec assay, you're never going to get there unless you're using doses that are huge. Back in the 80s, they used to think those serum values got up into premenopausal levels because they're using immunoassays. When we got good accurate values, we realized serum is not going up much with oral progesterone. So be real careful with that one. With vaginal hormones, there's really just a timing issue. You're going to give a vaginal hormone, you're going to get an increase and a decrease. When does it come? You really don't know that well. And again, you can watch the individual videos for thoughts on these. With sublingual hormones, you've got to be careful because it comes and it goes so very quickly that you're kind of shooting at a moving target. And be careful of continuing to increase the doses. And the same is true with the creams. With serum testing, you just don't get the increase that's likely going on at the tissue level. And so that's a complex topic, but I would be very careful with that. With saliva testing, and again, you can watch the individual videos, but with the sex hormones, it's really not a great method. It's okay if your lab is very good. There just really are some accuracy issues there in terms of the sex hormones, so they're just not as good as some of the other methods. Probably best to be used for tracking hormones throughout the menstrual cycle. For the adrenals, it really is still considered the gold standard, but as you'll see if you watch the video on adrenal hormones, there really is a pretty significant issue in terms of seeing, for example, low cortisol levels in saliva, assuming that there's very little cortisol being made. And with our urine test, that's where I really like that in terms of giving you a better idea of what's going on in terms of overall production. Moving on to oral progesterone, same sort of argument as with serum. The biggest danger there is probably that the values won't increase as much as you think, because it's gone. It's not there anymore by the time you take it at night, wake up and test. So if you're shooting for a target value in saliva using oral progesterone, I just would not do that. With the vaginal hormones, I'd need to see more data to be comfortable with that. But even at that point, you really have an unpredictability in terms of when those values are going to go up and when those values are going to go down. I do recall a situation where a man was putting on a perianal or on the rectal mucosa of the hormone, and the salivary values shot way, way up into the thousands, but just for a couple of hours and then crashed back down. And they were just really variable. And so what those numbers mean, I think, is not really known. So I'm not sure I would be entirely comfortable with that situation. But for patches and injections, I think saliva works just fine. Because of the issue with transdermal hormones, I'd be a little bit cautious with saliva. With pellets, Sublingual hormones, just please don't use that for saliva. That's not a good idea. And with the transdermal hormones and saliva, that's a long story. I don't think it works very well. You can watch the video if you want to know the details on that, but that's a pretty complex topic. With the urine test, the biggest weakness there is for the adrenals. You're going to get usually a total cortisol, not a free cortisol. So like Genova has a 24-hour urine, and they do an extra test to get the free cortisol measurement, and that's a good thing. They're still missing the diurnal pattern of free cortisol, and so for that I really prefer our test. But at least it's a free cortisol that they're measuring. Most of the other labs are measuring total cortisol. If you look through the literature, there's really very, very little in the literature about total cortisol. It's all about the free cortisol measurement, and the two do not correlate to one another. So I'd be cautious putting too much value in that. Oral progesterone with urine testing, I think the only problem with that really is it either it's just not that useful, but where there could be danger is if you have the mentality of giving oral progesterone until progesterone is in the normal range, then you're going to have a problem, because you can give 5-10 milligrams of oral progesterone and those urine values are going to shoot up into the normal range. But it's gut metabolism increasing the values of the metabolites that you're monitoring. And we know with 100 milligrams of oral progesterone, it doesn't increase serum progesterone that much. So those urine values have to be taken in a totally different context. So just be a little bit careful with that. And what we offer for that is to look at, and you can watch the video if you haven't seen that, but there are other metabolites to be measured that make it a lot more useful in terms of actually monitoring dosage. If you're using urine testing with oral estrogens, make sure if you take it the day of the test, which I don't recommend, you're going to get high values. And those high values mean essentially nothing, because it's all just first pass metabolites that have gone into the gut, metabolized into the urine. They've never been in systemic circulation as free estrogens. So don't put a lot of value in that if you don't hold off on the hormone for a little bit. Vaginal hormones with typical urine testing is a very obvious no-go. You're contaminating the urine with free hormones. It's not going to work. With our method, we remove those free hormones. And again, watch the video if you want the specifics, but we built our test to work exceptionally well for vaginal hormones. With patches and injections and pellets, urine is great. Sublingual and with transdermal hormones, this is true of 24-hour urine tests, and it's true of our test. The only way to make sublingual work really is either to A, just pay attention to the metabolites, or B, to really make sure you don't swallow that hormone when you take it, but that's really difficult to do. For the transdermal hormones, again, it's the same really long conversation about, transdermal hormones don't increase in urine. What does that mean? I think it means, that's a little bit of an underestimation of what's really going on at the tissue level. And again, watch the longer video if you want some more supporting information on that. But be careful. Don't chase transdermal creams up into the reference range and the young healthy levels, or you're probably going to overdose. So for our Dutch testing, our dried urine testing for comprehensive hormones, we really do think it's a better option for a lot of these situations. You're getting great, accurate mass spec values for the sex hormones, easily the most comprehensive look at adrenals now with melatonin, the free cortisol pattern, even the free cortisone pattern to kind of confirm what's going on there, and then the metabolized cortisol. It's a lot of information so that you're not getting fooled in situations in terms of what's really going on. As we mentioned with oral progesterone, I think it's a better option. For the vaginal, it's I think the best option that's out there in terms of testing. And so it really all the way around is a good test, I think, for a lot of these situations. But any of these tests, it can have a scenario where they're going to be useful tools, and every one of these tests, including our own, are going to have scenarios where they just don't work as well as we'd really like to see. And so the first job is to know which situations those are. And in those cases, either we're not testing or we're leaning much, much more heavily on the clinical picture in terms of symptomatology and those sorts of things. So I hope this whole series has been helpful. If you have any questions on the test, please do feel free to reach out, and we would be happy to continue this conversation with any of you on any of these particular topics. And we thank you for listening and look for more information as we go forward.